What if humanity's oldest spiritual pact didn't begin in temples or scriptures, but under African skies no one talks about anymore? What if the first agreements between humans and the unseen weren't written in books, but sealed in rhythm, land, and memory? And what if that story was never lost, only redirected? Tonight's revelation circles a forbidden idea, an ancient covenant formed in Africa between early human civilizations and luminous instructors later renamed, reshaped, and relocated by history. A pact that reappears across cultures under different names, different gods, different angels, yet carries the same fingerprints. This isn't mythology for comfort. It's a fracture in the official narrative. Because if Africa stood at the center of humanity's first spiritual exchanges, then everything we think we know about faith, origin, and authority shifts. Suddenly, the past stops being distant. It starts looking unfinished. These echoes still move through belief systems, politics, and identity today, especially among those taught to forget where the first knowledge was planted. What you're about to hear isn't meant to convince, it's meant to remind. If this story resonates, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These revelations traveled far once before, and they're traveling again. What if the story everyone knows didn't begin where they think it did? Long before temples had names and scriptures had covers, the African night sky was already crowded with meaning. Stars weren't decoration, they were witnesses. And beneath them, people listened, not with disbelief, but with expectation. There was a question whispered, never shouted, a dangerous one. Not whether beings came from the heavens, but where they chose to descend first. Funny thing is, most traditions point north or east, as if the continent below the equator were just scenery. That silence alone should raise an eyebrow. Across ancient African landscapes, the heavens were read like a living text. The Milky Way wasn't poetry. It was a road. Elders spoke of lights that paused, of sounds that weren't thunder, of presences that taught rather than ruled, not gods demanding worship, but forces offering terms. Those terms came with weight. Knowledge didn't arrive as a gift, it arrived as a responsibility. Fire shaped metal differently after that. Stone aligned itself with stars it shouldn't have known. Calendars appeared where writing supposedly didn't exist yet. Coincidence, of course. That's the comfortable answer. Still, the question lingered, passed mouth to ear, never ink to paper. If the first descent wasn't where history says it was, then the map of human origins tilts. And once a map tilts, everything drawn after it starts to look suspiciously incomplete. Before names were carved into stone, Africa already held a reputation the rest of the ancient world quietly depended on. It wasn't called a cradle back then. It was understood as a center. Rivers weren't borders, they were arteries. Deserts weren't empty, they were seals, protecting what wasn't meant to be disturbed. From the Nile's southern reaches to the highlands and deep savannas, geography shaped belief. Mountains were seen as listening points. Caves breathed heat and incense. Certain lands were avoided, not out of fear, but respect. People knew some places carried memory, the kind that doesn't fade when civilizations fall. There's irony in how later historians framed Africa as timeless and static. In truth, time itself was treated differently there. Past, present, and future overlapped like echoes. A ritual performed at dusk wasn't reenactment. It was participation in something ongoing, something older than language. Trade routes moved more than gold and salt. They carried symbols, rhythms, and star knowledge. Patterns found thousands of miles apart, matched too closely to dismiss. Same celestial alignments, same sacred numbers, same insistence that humans were not alone in shaping their path. And beneath it all, a quiet certainty remained. This land wasn't chosen randomly. Whatever crossed between worlds did so deliberately. The soil remembered the first footsteps, and it would remember them again. when the sky decided to lean closer. Long before words like angel or messenger existed, there was already an understanding that Earth was not neutral ground. In ancient African cosmology, the land itself was a meeting place, not owned by humans, not ruled by spirits, but shared under strict balance. Every action echoed beyond the visible. People spoke of agreements older than kingship, not contracts written down, but alignments felt in the body and confirmed by signs in the sky. When certain stars rose, certain rites were performed, not to summon, but to acknowledge. As if something was already there, listening. These weren't tales told to children, they were instructions wrapped in story. Elders taught that some forces offered guidance only if humans proved restraint. Power without discipline was said to rot the soul and poison the land. That warning appears again and again, dressed in different masks. Ironically, later traditions would frame these ideas as primitive superstition, yet the structure is precise. Access was conditional, knowledge was tiered, silence was enforced. Anyone who broke the balance didn't face divine wrath. They faced removal, forgotten names, erased lineages. That's where the tension begins. Because if Earth was treated as covenant ground, then someone eventually crossed a line. And when a line is crossed, even the sky remembers who did it first. They didn't arrive with trumpets or firestorms. That's a later edit. In the oldest African tellings, the first luminous beings came quietly, almost respectfully. They were described as tall lights wrapped in form, voices that vibrated rather than spoke. Not rulers, not saviors, teachers with limits. What they offered wasn't worship, but instruction. How to read the sky as a system, how to pull metal from stone without angering the earth, how sound could open memory and rhythm could alter perception. These lessons were never universal. They were selective, measured and often temporary. It's almost amusing how later texts struggled to explain them. Wings were added, thrones invented, moral binaries forced in. But the original descriptions are far less theatrical and far more unsettling. These beings weren't good or evil. They were bound by rules, just like humans were. Some traditions say they could not interfere directly. Others insist they could, but only if invited through ritual alignment. Either way, the emphasis was always on consequence. Knowledge changed those who received it, and not always for the better. That tension sits at the heart of the story, because once instruction is given, it can't be taken back. And somewhere along the way, someone asked for more than they were meant to receive. Knowledge never arrives evenly. In these traditions, it was parceled out like fire in the dark, a little at a time, enough to guide, never enough to dominate. The elders understood this instinctively. That's why learning was layered, guarded by silence, ritual, and time. Some were taught to read the stars. Others learned how sound shaped matter. A few were shown how symbols could store memory across generations, but no one received everything. Total knowledge was considered dangerous, not because it was evil, but because humans weren't meant to carry it alone. There's an uncomfortable truth buried here. Inequality of knowledge wasn't injustice, it was protection. Those who rushed ahead without grounding were said to lose their balance. Their dreams fractured, their bodies weakened. Wisdom without restraint had a cost, and everyone knew it. This is where irony creeps in. Later, civilizations obsessed over access, control, and ownership of truth. But the older system was built on withholding, on knowing when not to speak. Silence wasn't ignorance, it was discipline. Still, temptation has a sound, and once some began to whisper that knowledge should belong to all, the equilibrium started to crack. The next step was inevitable. They were known quietly as keepers rather than leaders. Certain lineages carried the weight of memory in their blood, not as privilege, but as burden. From an early age, they were trained to listen more than speak, to remember without recording, to guard without revealing what they guarded. Initiation wasn't ceremonial theater, it was endurance. Days without light, fasting until the body learned humility. Rhythms beaten slowly until the mind slipped into another register. Only then were fragments of the covenant shared, never whole, never rushed. Trust was earned through restraint. These lineages didn't rule cities. In fact, they often lived at the margins, near forests, rivers, or stone circles most people avoided. Power stayed invisible by design. The moment it became visible, it became vulnerable. That rule was absolute. When outsiders encountered traces of this system centuries later, they misunderstood it completely. They called it secrecy out of fear, hierarchy out of oppression. They missed the point. Guardianship isn't dominance, it's containment. But containment is fragile. And as populations grew, as trade expanded, as ambition crept in, the silence that once protected the covenant began to draw attention. Attention, as history keeps proving, is where corruption starts to breathe. Sound was never just sound. In the deepest African rites, rhythm was treated as a key. Drums didn't entertain, they calibrated. Each beat mirrored something older than language, syncing breath, heartbeat, and memory until the boundary between inner and outer worlds thinned. Circles of stone and earth were chosen with care, not for beauty, but for alignment. Certain places amplified vibration, carried scent differently, bent perception. Smoke from resins filled the air, sharp and sweet, grounding the body while the mind traveled. This wasn't escape, it was contact. Masks played a role that later observers never grasped. They weren't disguises, they were interfaces. By removing the human face, the wearer stepped aside, allowing something else to speak through movement and gesture. Identity dissolved, temporarily, by intention. These rites were dangerous if rushed. That's why they were rare. Opening perception without discipline was said to invite distortion. People returned changed, not always wiser. The line between guidance and intrusion was thin, and everyone involved knew it. And yet, the more these rituals worked, the harder it became to keep them contained. Because once humans realized they could reach beyond themselves, the question shifted. Not should we, but how far can we go next? Across distant cultures, the same images kept surfacing, almost stubbornly. A serpent lifting its head toward the sky, a disk of light resting above a figure's crown, a ladder, a rope, a path connecting earth and heavens, different tongues, same ideas. That repetition wasn't coincidence, it was memory traveling without permission. In Africa, these symbols were never decorative, they were functional. The serpent wasn't temptation, it was energy, movement, renewal. The disk wasn't a sun god, it was awareness made visible. The ladder wasn't escape, it was alignment. Each image pointed to a process, not a personality. What unsettles historians is how these same symbols appear later in places that supposedly developed in isolation. Same postures, same proportions, same celestial references. The explanation usually offered is diffusion or coincidence. Convenient words, easy to repeat, hard to prove. Older traditions didn't bother explaining, they assumed continuity. If knowledge came from a shared source, symbols would echo wherever that knowledge survived. Names would change, forms would adapt, meaning stayed intact for those who knew how to read it. And once symbols begin to travel faster than the discipline meant to guard them, misunderstanding follows close behind. What was once instruction slowly hardened into myth, and myth, when misunderstood, has a way of reshaping belief itself. At some point, balance tipped. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way most collapses begin. Knowledge meant to guide started to inflate egos. Skills designed for harmony were bent toward control. The covenant didn't shatter in a single moment. It eroded through use without restraint. Some lineages began pushing boundaries. They wanted permanence instead of cycles, dominance instead of stewardship. Rituals grew louder, more frequent, more ambitious. The sky was no longer consulted, it was challenged. That shift mattered more than any single act. This is where later traditions talk about fall, but that word oversimplifies it. Nothing fell from heaven. What fell was discipline. The understanding that access had limits faded, replaced by confidence that humans could manage consequences they didn't fully grasp. Ironically, the luminous beings didn't strike back. They withdrew. Teaching stopped. Contact thinned. Silence returned, heavier than before. Absence became the warning. The message was clear to those paying attention. The terms had been violated. And when guidance disappears without explanation, humans tend to fill the gap themselves. That's when imitation replaces instruction, and the original purpose begins to fracture into something far less stable. What followed wasn't fire from the sky or sudden annihilation. It was far more effective than that. Memory began to dissolve. Names faded. Practices survived only as fragments, stripped of their original context. Civilizations didn't vanish overnight. They were thinned out, story by story. Temples cracked and were left to sand. Stone circles were abandoned, not destroyed. Languages shifted just enough to blur meaning. This wasn't chaos. It was containment. When knowledge can't be erased, the next best option is to make it unusable. There's irony here that's hard to ignore. Later empires would claim conquest through force, but the deeper conquest was forgetfulness. When people forget why something exists, they stop protecting it. Sacred sites turn into ruins. Guardians become myths. Oral traditions held on the longest, passed quietly, often disguised as folk tales or songs. What sounded like simple stories carried instructions beneath the rhythm. Outsiders heard entertainment, insiders heard warnings. And as these memories dimmed, a vacuum formed. One that would soon be filled by new narratives, new hierarchies, and new explanations for the same old symbols. This time without Africa at the center. When new stories arrived, they didn't announce themselves as replacements. They framed themselves as revelations. Familiar figures were renamed, relocated, rewritten. What once belonged to the South was suddenly said to come from elsewhere, cleaner, simpler, easier to control. It's almost ironic how often Africa disappears right at the moment things become official. Texts get standardized, timelines get narrowed, oral memory gets dismissed as unreliable. And suddenly, entire civilizations are treated as footnotes to histories they helped inspire. Yet the parallels are stubborn. Flood stories echo older African cycles of cleansing. Heavenly watchers resemble earlier teachers bound by rules. Giants, hybrids, forbidden unions, all themes that didn't originate where people assume they did. They migrated, sanitized along the way. The irony deepens when you realize omission works better than denial. You don't have to argue against a source if you simply stop mentioning it. Over time, absence becomes normal. Silence becomes truth. But silence never fully seals itself. It leaks through symbols, rituals, and instincts that refuse to disappear. And those leaks would surface again centuries later in places far removed from where they began. The same pattern surfaced again, carved into stone far from their origin. In river valleys and desert cities, figures stood in familiar poses, gazing skyward, hands raised in recognition rather than prayer. Different climates, different languages, same posture. That repetition tells its own story. In Egypt, knowledge of the stars mirrored systems far older than dynasties. In Mesopotamia, watchers appeared with duties and limits eerily similar to those described farther south. Across the ocean, in the Americas, stepped pyramids aligned to the same heavens. Isolation starts to look like a convenient myth. What traveled wasn't armies or empires, it was memory, stripped down to essentials, sacred geometry, cycles of time. The idea that humanity once learned directly from something beyond itself. Cultures inherited fragments and rebuilt them in their own image. Later scholars would argue over influence, diffusion, coincidence, safe debates, tidy frameworks. But the underlying question stayed untouched. Why do these systems agree on so much while disagreeing on surface details? Because surface details are what change when truth passes through many hands. The core remains, and that core keeps pointing back to a source older than borders, older than scripture, older than the names we now argue over. Before ink ever touched parchment, Africa trusted breath and rhythm. Memory lived in voices, in pauses, in the way a story bent depending on who was ready to hear it. These weren't casual tales told for comfort. They were living archives, guarded by repetition and restraint. Elders knew something writing could never guarantee. Permanence invites theft. Once words are fixed, they can be lifted, altered, claimed. Oral transmission forced presence. You had to sit, listen, and earn the right to remember. Forgetfulness was the price of impatience. That's why later scholars struggled with these traditions. They searched for texts and found silence. They asked for dates and received cycles. What they couldn't catalogue, they dismissed. What they couldn't own, they labelled unreliable. Yet these spoken histories outlived empires. While libraries burned, songs endured. While manuscripts were edited, rhythms stayed intact. Inside chants and proverbs, instructions hid in plain sound, layered so only those trained could hear them. And that survival carried a quiet warning. When a culture refuses to write something down, it's often because it understands how easily truth can be reshaped once it leaves the human voice. That understanding would soon prove painfully accurate. What followed wasn't just invasion, it was reinterpretation. Colonization arrived wearing the language of progress, but beneath it ran something sharper, an urgency to cleanse, rename, reorder. Rituals were labeled dangerous, symbols were called primitive, entire spiritual systems were reduced to superstition with a straight face. It's almost ironic how familiar the tactic feels. When something can't be destroyed, you redefine it until it loses power. Masks became costumes, drums became noise, sacred sites became empty land ready for use. The covenant didn't need to be broken again. It just needed to be ridiculed. Missionaries spoke of light while actively dimming older fires. What didn't fit a new moral framework was declared evil by default. Deities once associated with balance and instruction were recast as threats, not because they were understood, but because they weren't controllable. This wasn't random cruelty, it was strategic. Spiritual erasure weakens resistance more effectively than chains ever could. When people forget who they were in relation to the unseen, they become easier to manage in the visible world. Yet erasure is never complete. Fragments survived in movement, in music, in instinct, and those fragments would later resurface, unsettling the very systems that tried so hard to bury them. Even after the silence, traces refused to behave. Stone tools appeared where timelines said they shouldn't. Astronomical alignments showed precision that supposedly required instruments no one admits existed. Sites oriented to solstices, equinoxes, and star risings long before advanced civilization was meant to be a thing. Archaeologists often paused, then moved on. An anomaly is manageable. A pattern is dangerous. So artifacts were isolated, dated conservatively, explained cautiously. Better to call it coincidence than to ask who taught people to read the sky with such accuracy. In Africa, some structures align with constellations no longer visible in the same way, suggesting knowledge passed down from much earlier epochs. That alone should complicate the timeline. Instead, it gets buried in footnotes, quietly acknowledged, rarely emphasized. Legends filled the gaps where evidence stopped, stories of teachers who walked away, of cities that sank into earth or sand by choice. of knowledge sealed until people remembered how to approach it without hunger. Myth, they say. Convenient word. But myth tends to gather around truth, like dust around gravity. And the more these discoveries surface, the harder it becomes to pretend they point nowhere. Something old is pressing back into view, asking to be seen without translation. The fear was never about the past staying buried. It was about the past being understood. Because understanding changes posture. It straightens spines. It rewires identity. And systems built on borrowed narratives don't survive that kind of awakening. Control has always depended on selective memory. Teach people what to remember, and more importantly, what to forget. When origins are obscured, authority feels natural. When origins resurface, authority starts to look negotiated rather than ordained. That's why certain questions remain unwelcome, not because answers don't exist, but because they destabilize hierarchies. If knowledge once flowed freely across cultures, then no single tradition can claim ownership of truth. And ownership is the backbone of power. Ironically, the resistance to these ideas often masquerades as rationality. Skepticism is encouraged, but only in safe directions. Question myths, but not timelines. Question symbols, but not sources. It's a careful balance, and it's maintained deliberately. Yet pressure builds. As fragments reconnect, as patterns sharpen, the old silence grows louder. And silence, when it becomes too loud, stops functioning as control and starts functioning as confession. Blood remembers what paper forgets. Across the diaspora, rhythms survived chains, oceans, and forced names. Movements resurfaced in places that never learned their original meaning, yet felt compelled to repeat them. Call it culture if you want. Instinct fits better. People danced patterns they'd never been taught, sang melodies that mirrored old invocations without knowing why. Certain symbols felt familiar without explanation, stirring something deep and uncomfortable. Memory doesn't always need permission to travel. Sometimes it just waits. There's irony in how this inheritance was dismissed as coincidence or adaptation, as if millions of people across continents independently felt the same pull toward the same forms, as if trauma alone could explain precision. Trauma breaks. This endured. The covenant didn't live in books anymore. It lived in bodies. In the way sound moved through crowds, in the way certain stories felt heavier than others, in the quiet certainty that something was missing, but not gone. And as generations passed, that unconscious inheritance began to stir, not as nostalgia, but as curiosity, a sense that what was lost might not be unreachable after all. In recent decades, something subtle shifted. Practices once mocked began resurfacing, this time spoken with care instead of fear. People returned to old symbols, not to imitate the past, but to understand why they never fully left it. This wasn't rebellion, it was retrieval, meditation, rhythm, ancestral memory. Concepts long dismissed as irrational found their way back into mainstream language, often stripped of origin. Funny how ideas become acceptable once their source is blurred enough. The wisdom was welcomed. The context stayed uncomfortable. Across cities and digital spaces, fragments reconnected. Scholars, artists, and seekers noticed patterns aligning again. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but enough to raise questions. The same ones that had been avoided for centuries. Who taught the first teachers? And why was Africa always edited out of the answer? This awakening didn't announce itself loudly. It moved sideways, through curiosity rather than confrontation. People felt drawn before they understood why. That pull wasn't new. It was remembered. And memory, once activated, rarely stops at the surface. It keeps digging, pressing forward towards something older still, something waiting beneath the next layer of forgetting. What emerges at the end isn't a revelation carved in stone, but a recognition felt in the chest. The covenant was never about dominance or purity. It was about relationship, between land and sky, between restraint and curiosity, between what humans could know and what they were trusted to carry. Africa wasn't the backdrop to this story. It was the ground it stood on. Strip that away, and the narrative collapses into fragments that never quite explain themselves. Put it back, and suddenly the pieces stop arguing. They align. The past in this telling isn't dead. It's dormant, waiting for conditions to change, waiting for listeners who don't rush to own it, explain it away, or weaponize it. That patience was always part of the agreement. What's unsettling is how familiar this moment feels, as if it's happened before, a cycle nearing its turn. Knowledge pressing forward again, testing whether humans learned anything from the last silence. And somewhere beneath noise and certainty, a quiet question stirs once more. Not whether the covenant existed, but whether this time humanity will remember the terms before asking for more. The story closes the way it began, not with certainty, but with reverence. What was shared between land and sky was never meant to crown empires or justify thrones. It was meant to teach balance, to remind humans that knowledge without humility always collapses inward. Africa's legacy isn't frozen in ruins or buried beneath sand. It breathes quietly through symbols that refuse to disappear, through instincts that outlive borders, through questions that keep returning no matter how often they're silenced. The covenant didn't end. It went dormant, waiting for ears that could listen without trying to own it. History, as it's usually told, prefers straight lines and clean conclusions. This story offers neither. It offers layers, echoes. The understanding that many truths were never destroyed, only covered patiently until the right moment to surface again. And that moment isn't behind us, it's unfolding. Beneath timelines, beneath doctrine, beneath fear, countless mysteries still sleep under the weight of time. And Africa remains their quiet guardian. If you feel that pull to continue, to listen deeper, to remember what wasn't written, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss the next revelation. The story isn't over, it's only pausing between breaths.